This is a Film Stories original podcast.
We made this.
Welcome to the Xcast. The truth is in here. I'll be your host today, Russ Hugo, and have a co-host today to welcome on, and that is the resident calligrapher and expert in many other areas, Cortlan Bartley. How are you doing?
Russ. I'm doing great. How are you?
A little tired, but otherwise great. So let's bring in a little bit more joy and welcome Cathy Glinski. Hello, and how are you?
I'm great, Russ. I'm happy to be here.
Well, thank you for joining us. To give the listener a little bit of background, if they looked too closely at the description, is we're here to talk about, in one way, maybe the statistics of the X-Files, or just different ways of looking at it. In particular, a really fun and unique project that Cathy has developed and shared with the rest of us in fandom to analyze some of the patterns and details and statistics of the X-Files. And I hope that's an okay summary. Is there another way that you might package that?
I call it my X-Files details spreadsheet. Yeah, that's about all it is. It's just a list of about 60 details that I tracked through a complete rewatch of the X-Files just to see how often they occurred, looking for any surprises, looking for any patterns.
That undersells it a little bit. Not to be too pressuring. So we'll work on the pitch. But if folks want to follow along while they're listening and check it out, they can go to myxfilesobsession.home.blog. And then if you search for the Great Spreadsheet rewatch there, or just the Great Spreadsheet, you should be able to find it and look at some of those details there. So maybe to start off, even though you have already done the 5 questions of X, there have been many X casts, and there's a lot of content to get through. Maybe we could do a quick refresher about your general background with the X-Files. So when did you first discover it and when start watching, and when did you first start engaging with fandom?
I started watching the X-Files with the host when it originally aired. My husband had been watching it for the first season and kept telling me there's this show about aliens and government conspiracies and mutants, and you're going to love it. And none of that sounded at all interesting to me. I finally gave in and watched it with him, the host, in season 2, and loved it from there. I then did not miss an episode if I could. I had 2 small kids, so I often had to miss, but I watched the X-Files religiously while it aired, but I didn't engage in any kind of fandom at the time. And it wasn't until the revival was announced that I started. I did a complete rewatch it was on Netflix at the time, and then I just needed more. And so I found social media and started engaging with the fandom there.
That's terrific. Now on to the actual spreadsheet. You describe a bit of this on the blog, and you just talked about it a little bit, but it is a fun project to think about. And what was the core inspiration about it? What was the inspiring moment or the idea? And I'm going to tie in a follow-up question. What motivated you to continue and see the project through to its final shape? Because it's a fun idea, but to actually go through and execute it with a show as long running as X-Files is something else.
I got the idea because I was watching DPO and I noticed that Scully was wearing sunglasses, and I thought that was unusual. So I took a picture of that and I posted it on Twitter just to get some conversation going and said, I bet this doesn't happen very, very often. And a bunch of people joined in the conversation, started saying, oh yeah, I'd like to track things like that in a notebook, or I have a journal on my phone. And then we just came up with the idea of a spreadsheet to track details. And I loved the idea because I don't know anything about spreadsheets. I just thought, here's a challenge. I'm going to stretch myself. I'm going to do something I would never in a million years think I would do. I created a spreadsheet, and I got lots of people giving me ideas what to include. I had over 100 suggestions of what to track. And so I whittled it down. I wanted to find details that I could quickly notice as I was watching, nothing that I would have to interpret too much. I didn't want to have to stop and analyze. I wanted to really just watch the episode and mark my spreadsheet and move on to the next one. So that's how I came up with the details I came up with. And they're all details that I want to see, or that the kind of things I focus on when I'm watching. And so that's how I got started. What kept me going is watching the X-Files isn't a hardship for me. I do it constantly. I think I started rewatching in 2015, and I really have not taken a break since, more than 3 weeks or so. So I knew I wouldn't have trouble going through the entire series. But what kept me going on this project, what made it really fun, is I would tweet about it as I was going along and get encouragement from people, or I shared the spreadsheet as I was building it, and people would say, hey, I watched this episode and I noticed this, and this. And I mean, that was a lot of fun. It's just having the participation with the fandom on Twitter mostly.
Could you have picked like a harder kind of spreadsheet to make for your first spreadsheet? Oh,
I have to tell you this. My first version of it was so bad. It was so bad. It was awkward and clunky, and you had to scroll through, and it was awful. And the first blog post I did with a link to my spreadsheet, it was just, I was getting started. And so I wrote about it in my blog with a link to, and they posted my blog post on Facebook. And a friend of mine saw it, and he's not an X-Files friend at all. He's a real life friend. He saw it. And just because he likes spreadsheets, he read my post. And within 10 minutes, he messaged me and said, I redid your spreadsheet. It might be a little easier to use now. And it was like mind altering. He made it so much better. I mean, he did this thing where you could just a checkbox instead of mine was awful. He fixed it. So yeah, I bet there are easier spreadsheets to create and to use, but this was a very me spreadsheet.
Yeah, it is definitely. It's definitely a very you spreadsheet. So my actual question, do you remember, out of the things that you did not include, so out of the categories you didn't keep in, do you remember what the weirdest, like strangest one that you threw out was?
Oh, I mean, a lot of them had to do with facial expressions and interpreting how Mulder and Scully were feeling. Like, is he coming on to her? Is he flirting? Is she flirting back? That kind of thing. A lot of people wanted to know how often she licks her lips or he licks his lips. And that was too much detail on something that didn't move the story along, or maybe it does. I don't know. So those were some of the details I didn't include. There were things like Scully's cross. How often does she wear that? I'm like, well, you could probably count 3 episodes where she didn't. So I didn't do that. A lot of people wanted me to track minor characters' appearances, but you can get that on Wikipedia or IMDb or whatever. So I didn't want to use the spreadsheet for that, where you can find it elsewhere. So.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah, licking the lips, that's a weird one. Maybe. That's kind of a weird one. That would be really hard, I think, to count eyebrow raises. Right. I'm not even sure like how you would decide what counts as an eyebrow raise.
And that was my issue. I didn't want to, there were still some items that I had to interpret whether to count it or not, but the various facial expressions were too difficult to try to watch and record at the same time.
I first relearned about it because I know this had been mentioned before and I looked at it, but recently in the XCast basement, a little bit of a discussion about the ratio of Scully saving Mulder, Mulder saving Scully. I believe it had to do with Millennium, the discussion of the Millennium episode. And that somebody came in and said, oh, we can go to the moderator. You can settle this score. And wondering, were there any fun projections and or debates pre or post or during predictions that people made that were found to be opposite of what they expected or turned out to be particularly surprising, in ways to, in a friendly way, to settle fandom debates? It just seems like a nice resource for that in a fun, constructive sense.
Yeah, and that really is the most frequently asked question I get. It's like, well, can you tell me how many times Scully was in peril or abducted or in danger? And isn't it so much more than Mulder? And that was it was, to me, the biggest surprise was finding out that no, and actually Mulder is attacked 66 times and Scully 47 times. When you consider that he wasn't even in the show for half of season 8 and all of season 9, it's not that she's in jeopardy more. So that was interesting. I think other things I've noticed that surprised me were, I always thought, well, Scully doesn't see. She never sees. There's so many times where she should have seen that and she didn't. And there were really only 8 episodes where that happened. And that was a surprise. And that's something that I can refer to when people said, oh, Scully, why don't you ever... Those were fun things to find as I was doing it. Other little things like doesn't Mulder have his hand on Scully's back every episode? He must, right? I'm sure I've seen that in every single episode, and it's much more rare than that. So that was fun to find out.
So, Cathy, you mentioned agents in peril, and that's like my favorite category. When I was kind of going through the spreadsheet, I decided that that was the one that I thought was like you kind of said, the most surprising and also most fun for me anyway to look at. I maybe did what I always do when I have a spreadsheet, which is make a chart. I was kind of thinking about it. I was like, yeah, Mulder is in jeopardy maybe more frequently, but does that change over time? Or, can we look at that, find any patterns that way? So I actually turned all of your account for agents in peril, and then for another category too, which we'll talk about later, into percentages, which was really interesting because you have the numerical. Anyone who hasn't looked at the spreadsheet, Cathy has listed the numerical sort of part of it. So for each line item, you can see Mulder is in peril 14 times in season 2, or I made that number up. That's not right, but whatever. So anyway, I turned them into percentages because I wanted to see what that looked like. And then I put them into bar graphs and
oh my God.
I mean, you say that, but you made this spreadsheet. I don't know what you thought I was going to do with it. Of course, I turned it into a bar graph. I did that for 4 things from Agents in Peril: how many times they were each attacked or shot, and then also how many times they saved each other, to see if there were any noticeable, changes. And obviously, season 8 and season 9 kind of skew that a little, skew the chart a little bit, because both of those numbers go way down for seasons 8 and 9 because they're both in it less, and Mulder obviously is in it much, much less. But I really thought it was really interesting how frequently their numbers are actually really close together. It's very rare that one of their bars would be much higher than the other. And like you said, I think that's the most surprising thing that comes out of this information.
Yeah, what surprised me was in season 1 they were dead even. Mm-hmm. As if it was planned. And maybe it was, because they were intentionally setting up a different kind of show. I think there comes a point where why are they in peril and what's the nature of the peril is different between the two characters. Someone pointed out once that when Mulder's in danger, it's usually something he did to himself. And when Scully's in danger, it's often done to her. And I did not track those in a spreadsheet. Obviously, that's someone else's thesis to explore.
And two, that's kind of the other thing I was thinking about as I was going through, as I was meticulously taking numbers out of your spreadsheet and turning them into percentages for a bar graph. I was thinking, yeah, Scully is in danger fewer times, but is she in greater danger more often? There's no way for the spreadsheet to reflect. I mean, Scully had terminal cancer. Scully was abducted and missing, and not that Mulder wasn't, but those things kind of.
Mulder was buried.
he was buried. Yeah, exactly. So those things are not that counts as one, and
yeah, exactly.
Does it though?
Maybe he was in peril every single one of the episodes that he was, or every month that he was underground. I don't know. It's a good starting point to then come up with a theory and apply it or explore further. And I haven't done a lot of that. I thought I had great designs to do so, but then life happened. The X-Files will always be there. I haven't gone further into really analyzing the things that I've pulled from this spreadsheet.
So the one thing I did notice on the Agents in Peril bar graph that I made, again.
But you're going to show us at some point, right?
I will absolutely share it. Don't worry. I know you can't see it now, but you will be able to see it later.
I keep expecting to flash on the screen.
Sorry. I'm afraid I will ruin some setup here on my computer if I try to do too much. So as far as how many times they're shot and attacked, it kind of jumps around, but they're pretty close. But it is clearer, looking at these things in color for me, because I'm a visual person. Mulder saves Scully more frequently in the beginning. And then Scully saves Mulder more frequently when we hit 5, 7, and then obviously 8. You know what I mean? And I was like, well, that's really interesting. That kind of shows. I mean, I'm not really sure what that shows. I just thought that was really interesting. And then 10 and 11 are a little wonky.
Yeah, I do find that really interesting. I'm looking at season 1 right now.
They're pretty even in season 1.
Yeah, I loved that in right in Deep Throat, Scully immediately saves the day. I mean, so it's not like we're halfway into season 1 and all Mulder's doing is saving Scully. That's just not how it is at all. So I liked finding that out. I like noticing those things. But it's interesting that the balance sort of changed on that one as you progress through seasons.
It does. Most noticeable, we go from season 2 and season 7. They almost flip-flop. I mean, not exactly, but they almost flip.
Okay. Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Huh.
I wonder how much of that has to do with Scully's arc of becoming more of the believer and then more agentive in those storylines.
Right, exactly. Or just at least more like holding her own as opposed to kind of following along.
Exactly. So the sense of actually getting directly involved with the cases instead of in being interested in them in that capacity and then getting in situations where she's more at risk.
Exactly.
Buying into the mission because it starts off, it's Mulder's quest, but it becomes both of theirs. And maybe that's more dangerous to her. I don't know where I'm going with that, but.
Some of these, it's fun to look at them at a niche point, like for Irresistible. For some reason, I didn't really connect. Technically, yes, Mulder kind of saves Scully, but in a sense, it's more of Scully's doing a lot of the saving of herself in that situation, and then the cops show up. Yeah, off of the hunch. And I guess it's a fair point to check it. I'm not debating it.
Yeah.
But it kind of goes into the complexity of a binary system and then why it's interesting to look at these in a different way of how do we delineate. And again, I think it's completely fair.
That particular saves item gave me more trouble than I expected because it did come down to interpretation. Do I look at just this one scene or am I going to look at the overall story in that episode? Like in Irresistible, for example, it's Mulder's profile of Faster, which leads them to look at the mother and leading to finally or am I going to just look at he rushes in with the cops or she's the one who's fighting Faster? These little details that I thought I could just check yes or no became a little trickier than I expected.
Sure. And I mean, especially for that particular example, there's no option to check that Scully saves herself. That's true. That's not something you were considering. I mean, as you say, you had to draw a line somewhere. Already a lot.
And I figure a lot of people using this spreadsheet know the story. You know, it's not like I'm trying to analyze each episode's plot through checkboxes. So this is more like I wasn't trying to summarize each story by checking boxes, if that makes sense.
Oh, it totally does. And I want to be clear, that was not a criticism, but I just wanted to highlight that the effort that went into this project isn't as simple as all of the situations like, oh, there's sunglasses, I can check it. You really have to do some degree of analysis. Yeah. And that's where I think it's really fun and valuable that this was spearheaded by one individual, such as yourself, who has this deep familiarity. So we have some consistency in the data. I think if this was done by a wider, more collaborative group, it would look very different and potentially not get finished or become unwieldy. It's not necessarily that it shouldn't be done by a larger group, because I think that would be really interesting to see, but on its own, the Cathy spreadsheet, being consistent from your perspective, makes this analysis in perpetuity valuable and interesting, I think, to fandom because of that consistency of thought throughout it.
I think that's interesting. When I started doing it, people had said, well, I can do some episodes for you. And I decided not to go that way, mostly because I like complete rewatches, so I was going to do it all anyway. But I did want to keep control over, to the extent there was any interpretation needed. I wanted it to be consistent. I note in my final blog about this was that if someone else took this exact same spreadsheet, they could likely come up with different results because there is no question about how often Mulder calls Scully Deana. I mean, there's no interpretation there, but there are some things where it took my choice of whether to call it something or not. I mean, I've had some criticism about Mulder ditches, like what I considered a Mulder ditch, and other people would say, well, that's not ditching, that's just, or well, you left out this. I'm like, well, I had to define it in my way so that I could decide whether to put the check mark there or not. Someone else doing this, gathering this information, or a group gathering it might come up with something different. So I'm not saying that this is a statistically valuable work. It's just meaningful to me. So, or anyone who wants to know how I watch the X-Files.
And I'm saying that it is valuable. So I'll say it on your behalf for those reasons. Not that it is the sole authority, because you are not claiming that, but it is still, it's a very fun way, hence why we're having the podcast, for fandom to analyze something as large and as complex as the X-Files and to lean into different areas of fandom that interest you and interest aspects of the show. There's a lot of characterization. There's a lot of shipping elements that are clear in here. And somebody else could do a different approach that is looking at exploration of geopolitics and could do a subheading there. It doesn't devalue any of this other work here. You have to figure out what's manageable and what's of interest and what you want to spend the time doing. When I first saw this is really neat because it is a large scope, but it's not too large. And there's a nice manageable focus and an intent behind it. And that the fact that you saw it through to the end, even though, yes, you're an X-Files fan, some people might just want to watch a show and not have to sit there and keep notes about details and get lost in things.
Oh, true.
So it is really, it's really exciting.
One of the things that helped me get through it was I feared season 9. I really thought, do I have to? I mean, I don't.
Yes.
And I don't mean that.
Yes, you do.
It's just, I do. And I do. You know me, Cortlan. You know I've watched season 9 many times. I watch it almost every time.
I'm just teasing.
But the idea of day after day filling out a spreadsheet with season 9 was daunting. So what I decided to do, because I was answering the same questions for each episode, I didn't have to watch them in order. So I decided I would do the season 9 Monster of the Week episodes. I'd do one a week as I was going through the rest of the series. So those were all done before I got to season 9. And when I got there, all I had what left was the mythology. And this was the biggest surprise in this whole project. I really liked the season 9 mythology when I watched it back to back. This is really good stuff. I mean, it doesn't compare to the rest of the series mythology, but on its own, when you watch it back to back, it's pretty compelling and enjoyable, except for those two in the middle that I don't know what order I still don't know what order they come in. Providence and Providence. They're there.
Those two.
No, but so that was one of my biggest surprises, happy surprises doing this project, was that I kind of liked season 9 more afterwards.
I'm in favor of anything that leads you to that conclusion. So excellent.
I wish I had tracked Monica Reyes' leather jackets because dang, those are nice.
Too many to count.
Maybe just every episode in season 9. Maybe that's all the tracking you need to do.
It would be like flashlights. There would be so many. Be like, why am I counting?
Very true.
I would like to do the opposite of talk about season 9, actually, because I would like to talk about the pilot. Because that, as I was rereading your blog posts about the spreadsheet, you even mentioned that you're surprised how well the pilot scores. Because I think you even said that the pilot, it was like a 23 or something. And then there was only one thing that scored higher than that, right?
Fight the Future was the only thing that scored higher in the entire series. That's a 2-hour movie, right?
Yeah, that's crazy.
And that was only a 24. So 23 for the pilot, 24 for Fight the Future, and everything else had less. That was a huge surprise. And I mentioned on my blog, a friend said to me, well, it's because the pilot sets the tone and that's what you're meant to look for. And I just don't think yes, some of it, but a lot of the little details that I'm tracking are not things that have anything to do with the story necessarily. It's just things that you expect to see as you're going through because they become so iconic. And 23 of this 57 are right there. Episode 1, which is amazing to me.
I thought that was amazing too. I could not believe that in terms of just the scoring of it. But then it also made me really think, like, is this a chicken and the egg situation? Yeah. Like, are we looking for these things because they're in the pilot?
Because they're in the pilot.
Or do we, I don't know, conundrum about the pilot in particular, especially since there was a huge gap between the pilot and even the rest of season 1. A lot of changes were made and still somehow the pilot is scoring so high.
And what's interesting for me, because I created this spreadsheet, I didn't see the pilot for quite a long time. I started watching with the host, and I was watching, one a week as they were aired and repeats whatever they repeated. So it was years before I saw the pilot. And I already had in mind what makes the X-Files the X-Files. And maybe that's why I'm so shocked by it. To go back to the pilot, now, I'd seen it several times before I created my spreadsheet, but just a sense of shock that it was all there right from the beginning when I didn't even start from the beginning when I first watched the series. I still think it's kind of amazing, all these little things that were there. And if you think about other things that make the series what it is, like conspiracy and black oil, and none of that was in the pilot. But all the things that just seem iconic to me, or so many of the things that seem iconic to me, were right there.
Yeah. Were there other episodes that you thought had a surprising score, either because they were particularly high or particularly low, or just not what you thought?
I can't think of specific episodes, but I did notice a trend that the mythology episodes tended to score higher. And I think it's because mythology was always going for a certain look, a certain type of storytelling. It's the closest the X-Files ever got to a formula. And so we tended to see those elements. Frank Spotnitz, a lot of his episodes are scored very high because he knows what we're looking for. And then I noticed that Vince Gilligan and Darren Morgan episodes tended to score pretty high, and they are two writers who like continuity, or they like detail continuity, whether there's story continuity. So they're going to find little things to stick in there to remind you of earlier episodes, whereas the other writers didn't seem as compelled to do that. I don't think there's any other episode that I can think of that shocked me. I mean, my favorite episodes all scored pretty high, but I created the spreadsheet, so.
Right. I should have went through. I didn't even go through to see. I should have checked to see how my favorites held up, but I feel like mine would also probably score high on your.
Tell me a favorite episode of yours.
Well, Irresistible is a favorite episode of mine. Beyond the Sea is a favorite episode of mine.
Irresistible 16, which is pretty high. Beyond the Sea is 14. Beyond the Sea, I liked the spreadsheet for that one because I was determined to draw conclusions as I was going through, which I don't know that I ended up really doing. But with Beyond the Sea, I think I was able to say that's when they became friends, not just partners, but friends. And it was just enough of the details in that episode, that the Deana and the touches and stuff like that.
Yes, the random touches is another thing that I made a chart for. I know you're surprised. It was actually a much harder chart to make because there are random touches. There are just a lot of them compared to other categories. So fewer conclusions to be drawn. I really thought that we would be able to look at some of these categories, the shipping kinds of categories. Mm-hmm. I put shipping in air quotes, guys. The shipping kind of categories. I thought, okay, well, surely we're going to see these things change or grow over time. And no, not really. No.
The things that grew over time were the more personal touches. Yeah, the touching the forehead touches or things like that. No, just these two touch each other just walking past each other. I mean, there's there's one, it's in Avatar, where they're just walking down some steps and Mulder's changing path to go to his side of the car and he just touches her sleeve. And I just that just is the perfect example of the random touch because it's just there. Hey, I'm here, or just for no reason at all. I had a lot of fun with that category. Yeah. I did a hashtag and posted pictures almost every day as I was doing this rewatch. What was really fun is I started seeing the term random touch pop up in fanfic. And
You're a trendsetter, Cathy. You're a trendsetter.
You bet I am. That was a fun one.
For a lot of the things that you didn't include about details, especially when it comes to things related to mythology and specific stuff like black oil, you did include green acid blood. And I'm wondering what inspired you to include that compared to all the others.
I think I like the visual of it. I like the idea that you can see it, spot it easily. Well, it takes no interpretation, right? It's there. The black oil gets into analyzing the mythology and what it means which is more than I wanted to do in this. I know at some point I considered black oil, and I think I felt that there was enough said about the mythology elsewhere. There would be a list somewhere that would talk about every episode that had black oil, and they didn't need me to track it in this. Whereas the green acid blood was more of a side detail. It's not a storyline of its own.
That was one of the things from your blog post about the mythology that I kind of made a note of. I thought it was really interesting because you say, and you have said just now, that you think that the mythology is where the X-Files found a formula. And I just never think of it that way in my mind. I tend to think about Monster of the Week episodes as being the precursor for other weekly crime drama, because there's a villain every week that we're gonna hunt down and catch, and that to me is very formulaic. We get it, but your spreadsheet is almost saying the opposite of that, where that the mythology is where the X-Files is the most consistent. And that's like mind blowing for me.
I agree.
That was mind blowing. I was like, wait, what?
I think with the Monster of the Week episodes, like anything goes, right? So it didn't have to look like any other Monster of the Week episode. They wanted every single one of them to look different from anything else. So it makes sense that it's going to, everything about it's going to be different. Whereas the mythology, we kept coming back to the same story. We want to remind people what this is about. We want to have a similar look. It surprised me. That was a surprise when I finished it and looked back at the scores. But when I think about it, I can understand why it would be that way. I think things like sharing an umbrella wouldn't necessarily be important to one type of episode or another, but the danger and the saving each other and things like that might.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that makes sense. It's a reasonable way to think about that, for sure.
I keep looking at different ones and thinking, wow, I'm a bit shocked that there were, about the sharing umbrella as an example. That didn't happen in season 1 at all. There's things like that it's very, very surprising. I recommend people explore this. And
that particular detail just took some interpretation, which I wouldn't have expected. But there was a scene in Shapes, season 1, where one of them's holding the umbrella and the other isn't, but they never quite both get under it at the same time. So I debated, do I count that or not? So it didn't get counted. So our first one was Red Museum.
That is one that you wouldn't think you would need to interpret, but yeah.
Cortlan, are there any other topics you want to bring up?
I think we covered all of the major questions I wanted to ask, except Cathy, do you think that this counts as programming, categorizing, or easily referencing the X-Files?
Sure. I think I've made it. Well, you know what? That is kind of funny that when you want to use this spreadsheet, I think it does help. I think it's easily referenced. And the reason I say that is the most common use I've had for it is fanfic writers contacting me saying they want their stories to be consistent with canon or not too contradictory, or they just need to fit a scene somewhere and they want to know when was the first time we saw Scully in Mulder's apartment, or did you track what side of the bed Scully sleeps on? I'm like, well, no, I didn't, but I did track every time she wears pajamas, and you can go look at those episodes. So I think that it is a way of easily referencing things that don't matter, but do.
Yeah. I just thought it was funny. The whole time I was reading yours, but all I could hear was Mulder and Fight the Future talking about it.
That makes me happy.
Yeah.
Have you considered expanding at any point on your next rewatch? And if
Absolutely.
so, what directions might you go? What topics might you focus on?
So I do have a list of like 20 details. And this was funny. As soon as I started, I kept thinking of things. Oh, I wish I'd included that. But obviously, there's only so much you can pay attention to. So I have about 20 other. I never tracked references to 1013 or 1121. So that would be fun because there's plenty of those. When one of them calls Danny, there are things that are phrases that are repeated throughout those series that I'd like to track. Like when Mulder says always, just as a sentence, don't give up, which I thought was just a I want to believe thing, but it really is throughout the series, I've noticed. So I'd like to track that. Whenever one of them talks about trust, I love when Scully says, I'm a federal agent, so I would like to track that. And I might try to think of expanding into areas that I don't necessarily pay attention to. I think that would be useful, and maybe more mythology-related items. But it has to be fun for me. I mean, not that the mythology isn't. I love the mythology. I mean, most of my top 10 are favorites or mythology episodes. But yeah, it has to be something that's going to be a fun thing and easily enough to categorize. Yeah, I want to know how often they say debunk. That's my favorite X-Files word. Oh. So I should put that in there. I keep talking about Spreadsheet 2.0. So one day I will do another one.
Yeah, I think that we've talked about Spreadsheet 2.0 at several points. I'm sure we've suggested categories. I'm not sure that they were very helpful.
Right. I get suggestions for details that, okay, well, I'm not going to put that up. Like someone asked recently, did you track how often Mulder wears a tux? So No, I didn't, but it was 2 times. I could just tell you that off the top of my head. Fire in Hollywood 18, that's it. I don't need a whole spreadsheet for that.
True.
So there are some very, very strange things that might be fun to track or might not be worth creating a spreadsheet for.
I don't know if it'd probably be fairly easy, but it might, in the sense to do it by Wikipedia, but I've also often been curious about locale, and you do some of that in here, but in the sense of, is it in a forest? Where does the primary story take place? Is it in the desert, or what region? To actually see how often do they go to the southeast? Is it just detour and et cetera? And it may not even be worth tracking, but that's something I've often wondered. It might be fun to see mapped out with one of Cortlan's. We could run it through R and get a nice plot.
Yeah, there is a great map actually. I can't remember what it's called anymore off the top of my. There is a map. I don't think it's complete.
I think it's like seasons 1 through 5.
Yeah.
I'm a bad fan.
I've got it right there.
No, I only know this because I looked up how many times they came to my state. And in particular, I looked up Kentucky, which is not the state that I live in, because there's only one, and it is in the revival.
So that work's already been done. And that's another reason.
Some work there has been done.
Yeah. Well, then I could just mooch that and be lazy.
I had forest and cemetery on my new list. So things like that, which would be easier to track in a spreadsheet, other than listing all the states and then checking which ones.
I was not trying to put that on you, Cathy. I'm sorry. I hope our friendship has not been severed by that connotation.
I've learned how to set limits.
I mean, but you did check rental cars and hotel rooms.
Did.
And I think that those are important X-Files locations as well.
Yeah. And with hotel rooms, I did limit myself to only if they're shown in a room they're staying in rather than investigating a hotel room. But I wouldn't mind tracking more relating to some other characters, like Skinner breaking the rules. How often do we see that? Well, clearly it's mostly Mulder and Scully here.
Sure. Yeah, I did think about that too as I was creating my percentages, because obviously, in season 8 and season 9 in particular, there are a lot of episodes, but very few that have Mulder in them. So your spreadsheet can't track a lot of things happening in those episodes. But I feel like you'd almost have to create a season 8 and 9 only. But maybe not. Maybe there are some through lines that I haven't thought of yet.
That would be interesting, yeah. I know that those episodes scored a lot lower, but just because so much of the Mulder wasn't there. Of course. Like the highest, the highest in season 8 of the Essence in existence, of course.
Sure. That makes perfect sense, though, of course.
It does, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to think about that for Spreadsheet 2.0. I'm going to
read
do that. Or maybe it's Spreadsheet 2.3, 1.8. It's not quite 2, but also not 1.
Oh, okay. There you go.
It's fine. I'll get there.
But have you thought about doing your own Cortlan at any point?
Oh, boy. No. 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 Have you thought about it, Russ?
It was pretty inspiring. If I ever did a rewatch, I probably would consult with Cathy and see because it seems like a fun thing to keep you motivated. And there are certain questions I would want to annotate, that certain sociocultural, sociopolitical markers, references to certain things that you could probably find through Wikipedia, but it might be interesting to see how often things are mentioned, even things like MK Ultra or something, where weird references or asides, or how many times Mulder's first prediction is correct, or how many different sub predictions there are, and how many different tangents they go. Is it actually paranormal in the explicit cryptozoological sense that he thought? Is it this specific cryptozoological creature? And at that point it kind of breaks out, but there are a lot of there's so many things to explore with a show that is this vast in both amount of content, but also the diversity of the content. And that's one thing I really love about seeing this spreadsheet and talking with you both and talking with X-Files fans in general, particularly X-Cast, is that people can be really excited and interested in engaging the X-Files primarily because of shipping, but still find fun things to pull away from the show in all those different areas, or in the platonic angle of the shipping, or in the sociopolitics, but they're not going to disconnect the characterization in general in any way. So even though I wouldn't classify myself as a traditional shipper by any means, so much of this data I would never have probably collected, but it is still really interesting to see, and I find it to be very valuable. I don't know if any of that made any sense, but I'm going to go back on my old card of being tired.
No, I thought it made I think for me, like I would find this kind of project really exciting, and then I would immediately feel overwhelmed. I'm afraid that I would lose a lot of steam too quickly to finish it, and then I would just be embarrassed that I didn't finish it. So.
This was the perfect kind of project for me as a compulsive rewatcher. I'm always looking for something to focus on for the next rewatch, basically as a way to justify the next rewatch, because, okay, I've watched it 3 full times this year. Do I do another one? Yes, I do. So what should I focus on? So currently, I've got a thread of Mulder's forearms because got to have something to focus on while I'm doing it. I did it. My favorite was that my X thread. I'd found an X on the screen in every episode of the X-Files. Not every episode. There were like 5 or 6 that weren't there. So that was, so I'm always going to find something to keep me going or something to focus on as I'm doing a rewatch, because I always want to do a rewatch. So I think that was why it was a perfect activity for me, because I was going to watch anyway. I might as well focus on something.
That X project was really neat. When I was on Twitter, that was a highlight. I want to be clear. I'm with you, Cortlan, 100%, and that I probably, too, would drop the ball. So I'm going to hold these two thoughts at the same time and reiterate them. It is extremely impressive that you finished this, and I don't want to think like, oh, I could do this, too, but simply the idea that finding the time to do a rewatch and the energy to do it with my current situation is very prohibitive to do a full one without following along with the XCast. So it just seems like a great excuse that I could use to justify to people around me that, I'm doing research here. Leave me alone. This is important work. So I was just going to plagiarize all of your work as a tool to provide me with some license.
How long did this take you, Cathy? Did we ask that? Like, over what kind of period of time did you do this?
I think it was 5 months.
Oh, yeah.
I started in end of October and published the final results in April. Wow. Or not, it was November to April. Anyway.
So that's an episode a day, practically, when you did your rewatch.
Yeah, that's taking time.
See, I think though, if it were going to be something that I did, like I would have to just do it all in like 4 weeks. Like I would have to watch like a lot of episodes a day, and really, I would just have to be like, this is all I'm doing now, or I would really lose steam.
Yeah. No, I typically watch X-Files not every day, but at least 4 days a week. I'm watching the X-Files. Yeah. It's what I do.
And we love you.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is a salute.
Hey, I want to give a shout out to a couple of other X-Files spreadsheets because they're amazing too. Auburn Phoenix on Twitter did a spreadsheet of Mulder's ties. She looked at every single episode, named each tie, figured out when it appeared, when it repeated. So that's awesome. She also did a timeline, Mulder's timeline, which I don't know if you know this, but it's really hard to figure out where he was, when, and why. And she did that. And then Annie Flowers, another XCast patron, did a spreadsheet of fanfic, which is really a great resource for people. So just wanted to give those shout outs.
We have to have another roundtable to talk to her about that, because the roundtable discussion about fanfic I found to be very, very, very interesting, and just a tip of an iceberg there.
Yeah.
There's so many things to explore. I know you mentioned that you had some people who helped provide feedback, and the rest it doesn't necessarily be comprehensive, but is there anybody that maybe you want to mention that helped?
I can't think of specific. I know Cortlan asked me a lot of questions as I was going through on Twitter. It's just mostly Twitter folks who just, here's an idea. Did we conclude this? And people who like to ask me about the spreadsheet. There's this group of people who do live tweet rewatches every Thursday night, the TBT X-Files. And a lot of people who participate in that will just shout out a question to me as they're watching. Hey, Cathy, have you tracked this one? So that is a lot of fun to me, to open Twitter late on a Thursday night and see all these questions about my spreadsheet. But I can't think of anyone in particular. It was just a group project of coming up with these details and then just encouraging me as I went along, which was a lot of fun. I did sort of tweet about it every night, and people would like, I can't wait to see this finished or whatever. So that was a lot of fun for me.
Cortlan, do you have any last questions? Then I'm just going to close by, if you had to pick one data point that is your favorite to each of you, what is it and why?
For me, I love Mulder, it's me, Scully, it's me. And finding out that was barely there to begin with, and then it really grew. But my favorite thing to realize is that Scully will stand right in Mulder's face and say it to him in person. Mulder, it's me. Like, that's my favorite thing to figure out as I was doing this. And that Mulder often, he starts talking as soon as Scully answers the phone, so he never says, Scully, it's me. He just says, it's me. But anyway, I had the most fun with those, other than the random touches. Those were the fun revelations for me.
I'm trying to decide. I have a couple. This is a weird one, though. This is kind of a weird one. Scully cries. Scully cries is one of my kind of more, I was pretty interested in kind of seeing that trend, like, over time, like what that looks like. Because I think especially, and this comes from my own interest in seasons 8 and 9, they get a lot of criticism for Dana Scully being out of character, being sad or crying or whatever. And I don't think that it's really that different from the rest of the show. I mean, based on Cathy's data, that was one that I looked at out of my own sort of interest, seeing how that changed over. I mean, she does cry more, but people are dead, so probably okay. And then the other one was the thing about Scully not seeing the thing, because I just thought that was funny.
I did get people laughing when they saw that included in the spreadsheet. Yeah, I thought, you have to check that, because that's like the biggest trope. I was like, oh, Scully didn't see it.
Right. She like gets knocked out or whatever. But I don't think it doesn't really happen that often for being such a big trope.
No, it doesn't. Less than once per season.
Right.
On average. Yeah. With Scully crying, what I loved is that she doesn't break down in tears and sobs, but she'll have that one tear because she's holding everything back, and yet it spills over. And it's one of the most beautiful things she does. So.
Yeah. Julie Anderson is amazing.
Yeah.
Obviously.
My favorite is also related to a mild methodological criticism, Cathy. So I'm going to end on a sour note.
Ooh.
This is a flaw with hey, look at the pup. Hey.
There's a dog in our
showed up on the camera. So this is, I think knows that I'm about to say something harsh, and it's here to provide more support. My favorite is Scully. In the line, hey, your spelling of it, all of that is perfect. It's wonderful. I was really excited to see it happens throughout. It's consistent throughout every season. But the fact that we're using a binary system, Fight the Future should get like 6 checkmarks. But you only gave it 1. It's the only issue. Everything else data-wise, I'm totally okay. But that's my one.
I have actually had someone say, no, you need to do a Scully project and just count every single time he says that. We want the total number of times. And that's really the only item on this whole spreadsheet that would benefit from that approach. Maybe not the only, but that definitely would be the biggest one.
And I was joking, but maybe we could raise some funding and get one of those clickers like Subway people use, and then we'll just hire somebody to sit there.
The idea of having to count the number of times something happened, that just that goes way beyond my capabilities. So.
That's why my statement was facetious, and I apologize if it was taken the other way. But if I implied it in the other way, I didn't mean to say that. It's put the inference on you. But it is a hoot, and I was glad to see, like, if it's going to be that many times to Fight the Future, it's justified because it is a trope. I mean, it is a factor of the X-Files. We were doing the rewatch of Fight the Future. I got the cornfield scene, and it's basically about 4 minutes were nothing but Scully's and a few Mulders. And I was like, wow, that's a lot. But now that's good. That's good screenwriting. It is a little over the top, but it's justified. It kind of goes back to the crying thing. And that this spreadsheet it allows us to reinterpret some stuff and get a different perspective. And kudos to you for doing this, for sharing it with the public, and for taking the time to talk with us about this.
Oh, thank you. It was absolutely my pleasure in every respect.
It's awesome. So many cool check marks. Everybody go check it out. Again, as a reminder, you want to go to myxfilesobsession.home.blog, search for the spreadsheet there. And also, you know what? I'm not even going to say follow Cathy on Twitter, because I'm now going to ask Cathy, why don't you tell folks what you're up to and how they can find you?
I am on Twitter tweeting about X-Files every single day. I'm at Catherine Glins 2. That's the most consistent thing I'm doing. Right now I'm working on Mulder's Forearm thread. It's a lot of fun. Come check it out.
Thank you. And Cortlan, thank you for all your help co-hosting this and doing all of the actual hard work. Where can folks find you?
You can find me on Twitter and Instagram. It's probably easier if you search for my name, Cortlan. And you'll find me. There aren't that many Cortlans, especially talking about the X-Files.
Terrific. Thanks again, everybody. And just as a reminder, the XCast is part of the We Made This network. There's a lot of great shows. You'll find something out there that will pique your interest. And the great community of the XCast expands even wider, and there's a lot of wonderful fan culture out there to mingle with. So go check them out. And please visit us again in the XCast basement on Facebook if you haven't already. I'm assuming if you're a patron and listening to this, you are. But regardless, come hang out. Let's have some fun. And the most important thing, as always, until next time, trust no one.
Elsewhere on We Made This. Podcast 616, a Marvel Universe podcast.
I definitely noticed that they weren't the actual voice actors. It didn't bother me. It didn't feel strange or anything. I mean, we as viewers have become so accustomed to seeing, Chris Pratt as Star-Lord, or Chadwick Boseman as T'Challa, or Dave Bautista as Drax, that in these instances, when we hear their voices and they don't necessarily match, it's like, oh, wait a second, that's not the right person. But, stepping outside of it for a moment, these are comic book characters. We're introducing the multiverse, right? And now we are introducing all of these tangents of stories that can go in any different kind of direction. So they don't need to be the same actor. They don't need to be the same voice one-to-one, in my mind. And as a fan, I can accept this. I'm okay with that.
The Movie Palace podcast.
Yeah, is Truffaut somebody you found yourself drawn to over the years? Have you watched a lot of his films?
So, just in terms of French New Wave, I think I've seen more Jean-Luc Godard than I've seen Francois Truffaut. But I really do love Francois Truffaut. I love his attention to realism and to small aspects of people's lives. And I love his stories and how character-driven they are. I've seen Shoot the Piano Player, Jules and Jim, which isn't one of my favorites, but I'm trying to appreciate it more.
Shipwrecked and Comatose, a Red Dwarf podcast.
Craig Charles looks cool as Sebastian Doyle. I would love to look that cool. Oh,
Craig Charles tends to look cool all of the time, though.
Well, true, but he looks more sophisticated cool than Rock-a-Dude with a band cool. And I'm getting old. I want to look sophisticated cool rather than Rock-a-Dude cool.
Craig Charles had apparently said that, it was great to be able to play this version of Lister because that's more like me. I'm the cool guy. Which I thought was great.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network. The XCast and X-Files podcast was created by Tony Black and is produced and hosted by Carl Sweeney, Sarah Blair and Kurt North.
You can find the podcast on Twitter at the X_cast, on Facebook by typing in the XCast, and in our group, X-Files Basement, the XCast podcast fan group, and on Instagram at the XCast pod.
Don't forget, you can support the show by becoming a member on Patreon. Our patrons get early access to episodes, behind-the-scenes chats with our hosts and a thriving community of X-Files, and other premium interviews and specials. To find out more and subscribe, you can go to patreon.com/thexcast. That's patreon.com/thexcast.
We are also part of the We Made This podcast network, full of popular culture shows, including our Millennium series, The Time Is Now. You can find all of our shows at our website, wemadethispod.com, or via Twitter at wemadethispod.
Thanks for listening, and keep watching the skies.